All right, we are ready to start opening our toolkit. The first tool that we're going to use is called 3/3 groups. Now, we'll talk more about the theory and the philosophy behind this later. But first, I want us to just experience using the tool. 3/3 groups go by many, many names. They go by names like T for T groups, Models for Ministry groups, My Hope groups, Discovery Bible studies, and many others, actually, bio groups. But the structure of them is all very, very similar, and they use similar principles. So what happens is you divide your time into roughly 3 equal thirds. The first third is look back. The second third is look up. And the third third is look forward. These 3/3 make up the structure of the 3/3 groups. So we'll get in our larger groups, the ones that are, 4 to 12 in number. And if you have more than 12 people, then divide those up into smaller groups of 6 plus. And we are going to do the second 2/3. And the reason we're only doing the second 2/3 this time is because we have nothing to look back to. So here is the structure of the 3/3 groups. In the first third, you'll note that it starts, the look back portion starts with care time. So you share a meal together or, refreshments. You hear how people did in the past week, hear stories, of things that happened, answers to prayer, check up on just how everyone's doing with their personal relationship with God, and so on. If there are people who are struggling, you spend some time praying for them, but then you may want to have, if there's something serious, you may want to have more extended prayer and caring time after the 3/3 group. But after you do these things over a meal, then you have your checkup time. And this is where you look back to previous commitments that were made the last time you met. Someone should have written these down, or actually each person should have written these down. And so each person will give an update on how they obeyed what they learned, who they trained in what they learned, and with whom have they shared their story, that is their testimony, or God's story, the gospel, with. After you've gotten those updates from everyone, then you have a vision time. This could be a story, a Bible verse, just an example from your own life, a slogan, a song, something to remind everyone of the big picture of obeying the great commandment and the great commission, loving God, loving others, making disciples. It's because we want to keep that big picture in view. Then, after you've concluded doing that portion, that's the look back portion, then you move into the look up portion. This is when you do a Bible study, have a Bible discussion. So whoever is facilitating the group on this particular day will open by praying for God to reveal His will, to speak to the group through His Word, to guide their discussion together. And then they or someone else in the group will read a Bible passage or in some cases, quote a Bible passage that the group will discuss. And after someone has read that Bible passage, then the facilitator asks, what did you like about this passage? And just whoever has input at that point will contribute. They'll share what they like about that passage. And when it seems as if everyone has had an opportunity to share all that they're going to, then the facilitator will ask the second question. What did you find difficult about this passage? In other words, either it's challenging, or you don't understand it, or you just don't like it. Any of those. What did you find difficult about this passage? And again, gives time for everyone to contribute. And you need to be very comfortable when facilitating to leave times of silence, sometimes extended times of silence, because people will either be going over the passage in their head, or they'll be reading the passage again in their Bible and thinking about this. So make sure you leave plenty of opportunity and aren't in too big of a hurry. You need to be comfortable with the silence. But after that second question has been discussed thoroughly, then you'll read the passage again, or have someone else read the passage again, maybe in a different translation if that's available. And then ask, what does this passage teach about people? And after that's been discussed fully, then you ask the fourth question, what does this passage teach about God? And whenever that has been fully discussed, that concludes the middle third, the look up portion of the 3/3 study. Then, to transition into the final third, I like to leave about 5 minutes for each person to pray and to ask the Lord specifically, what would you have me do as a result of what you've revealed to us in this passage? And here, we're not, for the most part, in most cases, we're not looking for general principles, general truths, but for a specific application that can be measured and done, and, to demonstrate whatever universal truth or principle might be communicated by the passage. How can we particularly, specifically respond in obedience to what God has revealed to us? In other words, again, pray, Lord, how do you want me to obey this passage? And then similarly, the sixth question, who will you train in this passage? So you ask God, who do you want me to share this passage or some truth or verse from this passage with? It could be fellow believers, or it could be non-believers. But who do you want me to train with this? Who do you want me to pass this on to? And then finally, is there anyone with whom you would have me share my testimony and the gospel with this week? And so if you spend 5 minutes with each person just silently praying to the Lord for guidance in this, and then after the 5 minutes, whoever the facilitator is should then ask for people to share what the Lord told them. So each person is expressing what God told them they specifically should do to obey, who they should pass it on to, and is there someone with whom they should share their testimony or the gospel this week. And you need to write down these commitments. In the next lesson, we'll go through how you handle this, the look back portion in more detail, but it will become important that you have written down these commitments. Then you begin a time of practice. And usually this is better if you break it up into groups of 2 or 3. And what you're practicing is the points of obedience, or the points of sharing the passage with others, or the point of sharing your testimony or the gospel. Some aspect of one of those you need to actually role play. So I might role play a discussion that I need to have with my cousin, or I might role play a phone call that I need to have with my uncle or my friend. I might role play sharing the gospel with a coworker at work. But some aspect giving me a chance to actually role play. And if you don't have anything else to role play, then at least role play sharing the gospel, because that keeps us in practice so that we're comfortable and ready to share the gospel should the opportunity ever arise. And then after everyone's had a chance to practice, then you spend time praying for one another. And so usually you'll pray for whoever you split up with in the group of 2 or 3. You'll pray for them in regard to the specific areas of application and sharing the passage and sharing the gospel with others. So you're praying for them as they make their applications in that coming week. And after everyone has had a chance to pray and everyone has been prayed for, then you close the group. Now, as we split up into our groups, I suggest that the person who facilitates the group the first time is the person in the group who has the next birthday that comes up. And of course, if you're using this as the basis for your church, you'll also have time in there for singing, joint worship, things like that. But today we will not put that in. We're just looking at the Bible study portion of the 3/3 groups. So if you'll turn off this video and meet in your groups, and then turn the video back on, and we'll discuss how it went. All right, if you have finished your group, you probably have some comments or questions about the process. Feel free to post those online, and I will get back to you with responses to those questions. Broadly speaking, there are 3 ways to adapt this 3/3 process for different audiences or different contexts. The first of these is to consume Scripture in different ways. The second is to change up the questions that you ask. And the third is by adjusting the passages of Scripture that you study together. So the first of these, how you consume Scripture, there are several options. For example, if you're working with a strongly oral group, then rather than reading the Scripture, you need to have someone who's facilitating the group to come prepared to tell the Bible story or to quote the Scripture passage, and then to do it a second time, and then to ask for a volunteer from the group to repeat the story or the passage with help from the group. They get support either from the person who originally told it or others who catch errors in the transmission of the story or the passage. And then after that, everyone will have heard the passage 3 times. And so then you can begin to discuss your questions. And then in the practice time, the first thing that needs to happen for every person when you split up in the groups of 2 or 3 is you need to practice telling the passage or the story so that everyone feels comfortable being able to repeat the passage or the story so that they can share it with others. They can pass it on. Another alternative, even for literate groups, would be that you read the passage the first time, and then after the first and second questions, rather than reading the story again, instead you have each person paraphrase it and share their paraphrase. Or in some cases, even with literate groups, you want to have them be able to quote or recite the passage. So there are multiple ways that you can choose to consume the scripture. In the model we're using, we're reading it twice, once before the first 2 questions and once before this third and fourth questions. The second way to adjust the groups is by changing what questions you ask. Some people like to adapt this. Some people like to add more questions. I would caution you, if you add too many questions, it makes the groups very long and it tends to actually reduce the amount people share. Plus, it makes it more complicated and therefore more difficult to reproduce. So I would be very cautious about going beyond the 7 questions that we have. Now, you may choose to, change something up in the first question or 2 or something like that. But I would suggest that you become comfortable and familiar with this pattern before adapting it. The third way to adjust these groups is what passages of Scripture you study. And there are sets of passages that we will provide for you, some that are designed for non-Christians, people who are seekers, who are willing to be in groups like this, or new Christians, or someone who needs an overview of Scripture. They don't have that background, and so on. So these are the 3 main ways that you can adjust these groups. One question that almost always comes up is, how do you keep these groups from teaching heresy? Is ultimately the intent behind the question. And the fact of the matter is that early on, especially with new believers, that it is possible that some things will be said that are in error in these groups. Look at this diagram. This diagram that I'm putting up shows how when someone first becomes a new believer, how they may vary significantly from the truth of Scripture, from accurate interpretation. That over time, this evens out as they become more adept at interpreting and applying Scripture, and they become more familiar with the breadth of Scripture, that over time this decreases. The fact of the matter is that the situation in existing churches is not nearly as good as we often assume. If you've ever looked at some of the research, for example, put out by Barna on the beliefs and worldviews of American Christians, you would be appalled at how poor it is. even the worldview and beliefs of pastors in evangelical churches in the United States would appall you. But in terms of the people in the pews, the lay people, our assumption is that they are accurate in their beliefs. But I would propose to you that this is because we never really give them a chance to express their beliefs. And if the truth were known, that the situation is not nearly as good as we think it is. In the groups, the 3/3 groups, those views get expressed, and so we become aware when there are problems. And as I said, over time, these begin to even out as they develop more expertise in interpreting and applying Scripture. So this is not something to be alarmed at. This is actually a good thing that these views are being surfaced. And historically, if we look at church history, the most impactful and damaging heresies and cults have been started not by uneducated lay people, but by highly educated theologians. You see, if Joe from down the street, the auto mechanic, says something crazy, we don't give it much credence. We say, that's Joe. It's not like a whole bunch of people are going to follow Joe. But if someone who's very influential and educated in a formal position of leadership says something crazy, people tend to say, oh, that must be right. I just don't have the education they have or whatever. And so lots of people follow them, even though they're interpreting Scripture in some crazy way. Historically, that's been a much bigger problem. But if you're still worried about how this will affect people's knowledge factor, their knowledge level of Scripture, let me assure you, you don't need to worry about that. This is anecdotal, of course, and in fact, I would say it's very atypical because the group of people I'm talking about were very smart people. Specifically, it was a group of Chinese college students. So they had obviously tested out in the top percentages of their educational cohort all along the way. So they were smarter than average. But we had about a dozen young college students from China, and this was in China, that they came to faith early in the school year. All of them came from completely secular homes. None of them had had any awareness or familiarity with Scripture whatsoever. And they came to faith early in the school year, and near the end of the school year, we had a little retreat and gathered these students that had come to faith together so they could fellowship with one another. One of the fun activities that we had them do during the weekend was Bible trivia. I had a Bible trivia game that had about 100 cards, and each card had 7 questions on it. And so we let them work as a group, these new believers who had been, maybe about 6 months each in the faith, and we asked them these questions and let them collaborate to see if they could answer them. And out of those roughly 700 questions, they missed 2. Not bad for folks who had been Christians for about 6 months and had no previous contact with Scripture. So, suffice it to say, if you're using these 3/3 studies and they're doing readings as we suggest, people can become pretty familiar with Scripture in a relatively short period of time. Anecdotally, I myself served as Vice President for Global Strategy with the International Mission Board, which is a Southern Baptist denominational mission agency. It's a very, very big organization. And one of the departments under my purview was the Global Research Department. So while I was there, we did studies through the Global Research Department of places around the world where there were large, quickly growing, fast-moving movements of multiplying disciples that were using these sorts of Bible study tools for the growth of the disciples in the churches. And we would send in research teams that consisted of people from different cultures, different countries, different denominations to be on these teams to help remove bias. And they would do in-depth interviews of new believers in the movements, of older believers in the movements, of leaders in the movements, if available, from other Christian groups that were in the same geographic area, which sometimes were available, sometimes weren't, and even non-Christians in the communities. And that we were looking for theological problems, for heresies, trying to determine, because of the fast growth and the quick multiplication, the fact that everybody was involved, was that creating situations where heresies were popping up everywhere? And interestingly, it turned out to be far better than we'd hoped. Now, sure, there were some problems, but probably the biggest issue that came up was in one of the people groups in India, specifically the Khoi in Orissa State in India, had a pattern where they would delay baptism, and that isn't biblical. Now, is that good? No. Is it catastrophic? No. I mean, that's not a primary issue. That's not a secondary issue. At best, that's a tertiary issue. That is not, critical to the heart of what it means to be a follower of Christ. And yet that was the most severe systemic issue that we found in any of the movements. Now, we looked at a dozen movements while I was there, and that was the worst problem. Now, am I saying that heresy can't happen in a movement like this? No, I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that it's not typical of a movement like this. Sure, it could happen, but it can happen in any model of ministry. But it doesn't typically happen because there's so much accountability and so much communication. And as you'll see later, there are other tools that help contribute to the health of these movements so that heresy in the groups over time is not generally an issue. So I just wanted to mention that fact. One other question that often comes up is about the leadership. Who's the elder, who's the pastor in the group? You remember we talked about the three types or the three ways that the word church is used in Scripture: the universal church, the city or regional church, and the simple church or the church in the home. And in Scripture, the city or regional churches consisted of multiple simple churches. And it's at that level that we see deacons, that we see elders, that we see the leadership gifts: apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. those things are generally practiced, and their influence is at that city or regional church level. So there is accountability within that network of simple churches. There is leadership. There are places people can go to check if they have questions or if there are issues that come up that they can't deal with, and so on. But that doesn't have to take place at the simple church level. That can be accessed at the city regional church level as it's needed. And so people worry that there aren't elders or aren't deacons or aren't qualified leaders in the church. What happens at the simple church level is the sort of things that are common to all followers of Christ, that as part of the priesthood of the believer, everyone is competent to deal with and needs to be competent to deal with. And the higher level questions and issues that come up, these can be, in a sense, kicked up line to the city or regional church. So you don't have to have all the answers at the simple church level. In fact, in my own simple church, sometimes if a question is raised that I think I have a good answer to, but in some way I feel it might give people a sense that they cannot access Scripture the same way that I can, that I will intentionally not give an answer. We'll just leave the question out there as a question. We don't have to have all the questions whenever we discuss Scripture. And I want to model that in the group. So you may have other issues that come to your mind as you have gone through the second 2/3 of these 3/3, and if so, please send those questions to me.